Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure to be joining you for this virtual Normal Labour and Birth Conference and to be speaking with you about the International Confederation of Midwives and the work that we're doing to strengthen midwifery education globally. For those of you who don't know us, we're nearly 100 years old. At this time, we have 142 midwives associations around the world and across all 6 regions of ICM. We have a board, a 13-member board elected by the ICM membership, and that board represents the diversity of all of ICM's members. So from and through those midwives associations, ICM's speaking for over 1 million midwives globally. And we've got some important roles, including setting global standards for midwifery. Our vision is a world where every childbearing woman has access to care from a midwife for herself and for her baby. And we work to strengthen midwives associations and to advance the profession of midwifery globally by promoting autonomous midwives as the most appropriate caregivers for childbearing women and for keeping birth normal. The ICM board is currently working on the next triennial strategy from 2021 to 2023. And that will be available at the beginning of 2021. I just want to focus on the second of the emerging strategic themes that you can see here, and that is the development, strengthen, and to develop, strengthen, and support the rollout of a new professional framework for midwifery, because that's going to be important core work for ICM over the next triennium. We've been thinking a lot about a midwifery profession and all of the elements that it needs. And of course, it starts with the mother and her baby at the centre. It's the centre of everything we do. But that mother and baby need to be cared for by midwives who have been educated through a program that meets the global standards for midwifery education. And those midwives need to be registered, licensed, regulated, and demonstrate continuing competence through regulatory activities that meet the ICM's global standards for midwifery regulation. Those midwives need to be members of the midwives associations in their country, and those associations need to be recognised both by midwives and by decision makers as the voice for midwives and midwifery in their country. The whole midwifery workforce needs to be integrated into a well-resourced, fully functioning and supportive health system. And we often talk about this as the enabling environment. And then, because we are largely a women's profession working with and for women, we face many barriers from gender inequality. And what we need is a world where women and midwives are valued, respected, and have the same rights as men. You'll be familiar with this model, the 3 pillars of a midwifery profession. The ICM has talked about this for at least the last 10 years. But when we have looked at this, we think that there's some elements that are missing now. And so we've been reviewing it and we are updating the professional framework. So we keep the pillars or the elements of education, of regulation, of association, because they're incredibly important. But we've also added midwifery leadership because that's a very important element to bringing about change. We've of course kept research because we need research evidence for midwifery. And we've added midwife-led continuity of care models of practice because research tells us that these are the models of practice that have the most impact on improving the outcomes for women and their babies. And underpinning and integrated with all of these is the midwifery philosophy and the essential competencies for midwifery practice. So all of the pieces here, we've set them out as a puzzle because they're all integrated. They need to all work together. But having our own philosophy and our own model of practice and our own competencies really sets us apart from other health professions working in the maternal and newborn health area. They're what make us distinctly different from nurses, from obstetricians, from paediatricians. Around all of this is the enabling environment and all of the elements that need to be in place in order for midwives to practice successfully and produce the outcomes that we know they can. And as I mentioned already, around all of that is the need for gender equality. So this is the new professional framework for midwifery that ICM will be rolling out over the next 3 years. Now, I know that you're all very familiar with the impact that midwives can make, so I'm not going to spend time on this slide. But just to reiterate that autonomous midwives, when they work across their full scope of practice, as defined by the ICM, in a midwife-led and continuity of care model, they will prevent complications, they will save lives, they will improve outcomes, and they increase women's satisfaction with care. So it's very important that we convince governments about the impact of midwives and why they need to invest in midwives. When we're looking at how we strengthen midwifery globally and how we implement this professional framework, again, I'm not going to go through this whole slide. I've already talked about education and regulation and associations and the enabling environment. The important need for us to practice to our midwifery philosophy and within midwife-led models of care, we need to get those set up. It's also very important that midwives continue to maintain their competence. So not just the day they registered, but every other day of their practice, they need to continue to be competent. We need to collect our data better. It needs to be data about midwives, about midwife-led care, and we need more research evidence for the impact and the value of care from midwives to make the case for investment. We need many actions to address the existing barriers to quality of care from gender inequality, and we need to work in a focused, collaborative and coordinated way with our midwives, with midwives associations, our partners, women and their families, governments and donors. So I'm going to focus on just a few things that relate specifically to midwifery education, so not the full professional framework here. But the essential competencies for midwifery practice that you will be familiar with that were first developed in 2010, and these were updated last year, and they look quite different. We now have 4 interrelated categories. One category that runs across all of the other three, and then one that's focusing on pre-pregnancy and pregnancy antenatal care, one focusing on labour and birth care, and one focusing on postpartum care for the mother and the baby. But they're all interrelated, and the generic competencies that run across all of them are about how midwives behave and their attitudes and so on. They're all holistic statements that reflect the ICM's philosophy and model of care and scope of practice. And they need to be embedded in all midwifery curricula so that students are learning the knowledge and the skills and behaviours they need to meet these competencies. We're working with midwife educators to understand how they understand and use the essential competencies, and we're developing tools to help them with assessment. We're also working with regulators and midwives associations on the need for establishing continuing competence requirements in countries. You're also familiar with the ICM's Global Standards for Midwifery Education that were developed in 2010 and updated in 2013. They are also being reviewed at this time, and the new ones will come out, or the updated ones will come out next year. These set the minimum standards expected for quality pre-service education, and there's various supporting documents that go with them that are also under review. It's also very important, and they link very closely with the essential competencies, so that these programs are producing midwifery graduates that meet the competencies. One of our new programs is our Midwifery Education Accreditation Program, or MEAP. It was developed over the last 3 years, and our initial rollout now is in Rwanda, Bangladesh and Somaliland. It's an accreditation program that's based on international best practices, and it's evaluating pre-service midwifery programs against the global standards, ICM's global standards. It sets a benchmark for international standards. It helps us to identify best practices and areas for improvement. It's voluntary, so midwifery schools decide if they want to engage with this or not. And it has 4 main stages, as you would expect in an accreditation program. An expression of interest. If programs meet that criteria, then they can engage in the application process, where they do an extensive self-assessment and provide evidence of how they think they meet the global standards. That's assessed by our ICM accreditation experts, And they go and do an in-country assessment to triangulate and look at in practice what's happening in practice against what they've read that's been submitted from the schools. And then they make a report and recommendations to the board. And the board will decide either to accredit the midwifery program or that their accreditation will be provisional on them meeting certain requirements, or that they don't meet the standards at all. And so we expect that many more programs will engage with the MEAP over the next few years. In doing this, though, we also identified that there's many programs that have many gaps right now and clearly could not be accredited. So how does ICM help these midwifery programs to develop and strengthen? And we've come up with the concept of the MPath, or the Midwifery Education Development Pathway. And at the moment, we're looking at all of our resources and how we strengthen those. I've mentioned the fact that we are, reviewing and updating the global standards, and we're also working on a self-assessment tool for midwife educators to assess the gaps in their programs. We are working on curriculum mapping tools for the essential competencies, resources for curriculum design, resources to train and support educators, resources that focus on instructional design, competency development and assessment design. And we're working on how to develop a network of pre-service midwifery education programs so that schools can support each other, and we build up a whole network of schools. That's it. Short and sweet in a nutshell. Thank you very much for listening.